Millionaire CEO sees twins selling their toy car to save their mother, not knowing that their lives would change. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The autumn wind swept through Central Park, carrying dried leaves past the worn bench where twin boys sat quietly. Zach and Lucas Wilson, identical down to the freckles scattered across their noses, huddled together against the morning chill. Between them rested a shiny red toy car, weathered at the edges but still gleaming where the sun caught its surface. "Someone's gotta want it," Zach whispered, his small hands nervously turning the toy. "It's the coolest car ever." Lucas nodded, swallowing hard as he scanned the passing crowd. His stomach rumbled, but he ignored it. They hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager breakfast, but food wasn't the priority now. Not with their mother lying pale and weak in their tiny apartment. "Let's try over there," Lucas suggested, pointing toward the busier path where business people hurried to work. The twins positioned themselves strategically, summoning courage beyond their 10 years. Their identical blue eyes, serious and determined, watched each passerby with desperate hope. "Excuse me, sir," Zach called to a man in an expensive suit. "Would you like to buy our car? It's really special." The man walked past without acknowledging them. This pattern repeated throughout the morning, people rushing by, some offering pitying glances, others pretending not to see them at all. "Need to try harder," Lucas said finally, his voice breaking. "Mom needs the medicine today." Across the park, a tall figure emerged from a sleek black car. Blake Harrison adjusted his custom-tailored suit jacket, nodding curtly as his driver confirmed his afternoon meeting schedule. At 42, Blake had built Harrison Industries into a global technology empire, his name synonymous with innovation and ruthless business acumen. "I'll walk through the park," he told his driver. "Meet me on the east side in 15 minutes. Blake moved with purpose, his expression neutral as he mentally reviewed quarterly projections. He barely registered the people around him until a small voice cut through his thoughts. "Sir? Would you buy our car, please?" Blake's stride faltered. Something in that voice, its desperate sincerity, made him stop. He turned to see twin boys looking up at him, identical faces pinched with anxiety. One held out a toy car like it. It was a precious artifact. "We're selling it," the boy continued. "It's really fast and the door's even open." Blake found himself staring at the twins, an unexpected tightness forming in his chest. Something about their earnest faces, the careful way they handled the toy, as if parting with a treasure, resonated with him in a way he couldn't explain. "How much?" Blake heard himself ask. The twins exchanged glances. "Whatever you can pay," the one holding the car answered. "We just need it for our mom. She's really sick." Blake's gaze lingered on the toy car. It was obviously cherished, clean, despite its age, with clear fingerprints showing where small hands had gripped it countless times. Without fully understanding why, he reached for his wallet and removed several large bills. "Here," he said, extending the money. "Will this help?" The boys' eyes widened at the amount, far more than they'd hoped for. Zach carefully placed the toy car in Blake's palm, his small fingers lingering for a moment before reluctantly pulling away. "Thank you, sir," Lucas said, his voice trembling with relief. "This will help our mom a lot." Blake pocketed the car, watching as the twins gripped the money tightly and hurried away. He should have continued his walk, returned to the day's agenda and forgotten this brief interaction. Instead, he found himself watching the boys' retreating figures, those identical heads bent together in urgent conversation. Blake turned to his driver, who had followed at a discreet distance. "Follow them," he said quietly, surprising himself with the command. "I want to see where they live." As his car moved slowly behind the hurrying twins, Blake stared at the toy car now resting in his hand. It had been years since anything had disrupted his carefully ordered existence. Years since he had felt this pull, this need to understand something beyond profit margins and strategic acquisitions. Blake Harrison didn't believe in fate or coincidence. But as he watched those twin boys through the tinted window, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. something that would change everything. Blake's car followed the twins to a dilapidated apartment building in one of the city's forgotten neighborhoods. The contrast between his sleek vehicle and the crumbling surroundings couldn't have been starker. As the boys disappeared inside, Blake sat motionless, the toy car still in his hand. "Wait here," he told his driver, stepping out before he could reconsider. The building's stairwell smelled of mildew and despair. Blake climbed 4 flights, following the sound of excited children's voices until he reached a door with peeling paint. He hesitated, then knocked firmly. The door opened slightly, revealing one twin's suspicious face. "It's the man from the park," he called over his shoulder, eyes wide with confusion. The door opened wider. Both boys stood there, uncertainty written across their identical faces. Behind them, Blake glimpsed a small, sparse apartment and the outline of a woman lying on a mattress. "Can I come in?" Blake asked. His usual commanding tone softened. After a moment's hesitation, the boys stepped aside. Inside, the apartment was clean despite its poverty. What struck Blake most was what was missing. No excess, no comforts, just bare necessities. "My mom's sleeping," one twin whispered. Lucas, Blake thought, though he wasn't certain. Catherine Wilson lay on a thin mattress, her breathing labored, skin ashen against the worn sheets. Even in illness, her resemblance to her son's was unmistakable. The same delicate features, though her once vibrant face was now hollow with suffering. "How long has she been like this?" Blake asked quietly. "Weeks," Zach answered, his small shoulders sagging. "She gets worse every day." Blake knelt beside the mattress, gently touching Catherine's arm. Her skin burned with fever. "She needs a hospital," he said decisively. "We don't have money," Lucas replied, his voice small. "That's why we were selling our car." Blake looked at the toy still in his pocket, then at the desperate faces of the twins. Something inside him, something he thought long buried, stirred to life. "I'll take care of it," he said firmly. The boys exchanged glances. "How will we ever pay you back?" Zach asked, clutching the money they'd earned. Blake's expression softened unexpectedly. "You already sold me your car, remember? Now it's my turn to help." Without waiting for their response, Blake lifted Catherine gently in his arms. She mumbled something incoherent, too weak to resist. The twins followed anxiously as Blake carried their mother down the stairs and into his waiting car. "Where are we going?" Lucas asked, holding his mother's limp hand. "To people who can help her," Blake answered, already dialing his phone. As the car pulled away, Blake found himself wondering what had possessed him to get involved. For years he'd built walls around himself, focused solely on his empire, avoiding anything that might reawaken the pain he'd buried so deeply. Yet something about these twins and their desperate situation had breached those defenses. Looking at their worried faces in the back seat, Blake understood with startling clarity that his carefully isolated life had just become irrevocably entangled with theirs. The emergency room doors slid open as Blake carried Catherine inside, the twins trailing anxiously behind. His commanding presence cut through the usual waiting procedures, and within minutes, doctors were examining Catherine while nurses guided the concerned boys to nearby chairs. "Severe dehydration, probable kidney failure," a doctor murmured, checking Catherine's vitals. "How long has she been like this?" "They say weeks," Blake replied, watching as the medical team worked with efficient urgency. "Will she recover?" The doctor's expression remained professionally neutral. "She needs immediate treatment. Are you family?" Blake hesitated only briefly. "Yes," he answered firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Tests confirmed. The doctor's initial assessment: severe kidney disease requiring immediate dialysis. Blake authorized all necessary treatments without hesitation, signing forms and providing his insurance information as if he'd been caring for Catherine his entire life. Hours later, Blake found himself sitting between the exhausted twins in a quiet hospital corridor. The boys leaned against him, fighting sleep but losing the battle. Neither had left their mother's side until the doctors had insisted they step out during a procedure. Is Mom going to die? Lucas whispered, his small voice cracking. Blake looked down at the boy, seeing fear in those blue eyes that seemed far too wise for their years. No, he said with certainty. She's getting the best care possible now. But what happens after? Zach asked, equally concerned. We can't stay at the hospital forever. The question hung in the air. Blake had been so focused on getting Catherine treatment that he hadn't considered what would come next. The thought of sending these children back to that barren apartment while their mother recovered was unthinkable. You'll come stay with me, Blake heard himself say, the words forming before he'd fully considered them. Just until your mother is better. The twins exchanged doubtful glances. Your house must be really big, Lucas said after a moment, trying to imagine it. It is, Blake confirmed, feeling strangely self-conscious about his wealth for the first time in years. Plenty of room for both of you. When Catherine was finally stabilized and sleeping, a nurse approached with paperwork and questions about childcare arrangements. Blake smoothly took charge, explaining that the boys would be staying with him. His confident tone left no room for argument or suspicion. As they prepared to leave, Blake watched the twins say goodbye to their unconscious mother, each placing a gentle kiss on her forehead with a tenderness that tightened his chest. These children, who had every reason to be broken by circumstance, showed a resilience and love that stirred something long dormant within him. The drive to Blake's estate was silent, the twins pressed together in the back seat, occasionally whispering to each other as the city landscape gave way to manicured suburbs and eventually the private road leading to Blake's mansion. When the car stopped before the imposing structure, the boys' exhaustion momentarily lifted, replaced by awe at the sheer size of the house illuminated by subtle landscape lighting. You live here alone? Zach asked as they stepped out of the car. Blake nodded, suddenly seeing his home through their eyes, grand, impressive, and utterly empty of what truly mattered. Not tonight, he said quietly, leading them toward the massive front doors. Tonight, you're here too. Morning light streamed through tall windows as Zach and Lucas cautiously explored their temporary home. The mansion's grandeur overwhelmed them. Crystal chandeliers hanging from vaulted ceilings, artwork worth more than their entire life's possessions, and corridors leading to seemingly endless rooms. Do you think he has a pool? Lucas whispered, excitedly. Probably 3, Zach replied, running his hand along a marble banister. The boys had slept in a guest suite larger than their apartment, in beds so soft they'd felt like they were floating. Despite their concern for their mother, childish wonder temporarily overtook worry as they discovered each new corner of Blake's estate. Blake watched them from his study doorway, coffee in hand. He'd made several calls already, arranging for Catherine's continued treatment, postponing meetings, and instructing his housekeeper to purchase necessities for the twins. He couldn't explain his actions even to himself. The hospital called, Blake announced as the boys rounded a corner. Your mother is stable. She's responding well to treatment. Both faces lit up with identical expressions of relief. Can we see her today? Lucas asked hopefully. This afternoon, Blake promised. Have you eaten? The twins shook their heads. Blake led them to the kitchen, where his housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, had prepared breakfast. The woman raised an eyebrow at the unlikely house guests, but said nothing, as she served plates piled with food. Eat, Blake instructed, checking his phone as messages accumulated. The boys needed no encouragement, devouring the meal with barely concealed desperation. Later, as Blake answered emails, he heard a commotion outside his study. You can't go in there, Mrs. Winters was saying firmly. Blake opened the door to find Zach attempting to peer around the housekeeper into a room at the end of the hall, a room Blake kept permanently locked. That door is always closed, Mrs. Winters explained apologetically. I tried to tell them. It's fine, Blake interrupted, his voice tight. To the twins, he added, that room is private, the rest of the house is yours to explore, but that room remains closed. Understood? Both boys nodded, chastened by his sudden coldness. That afternoon, Blake's driver took them to the hospital. Catherine was awake, though weak, her face brightening at the sight of her sons. My boys, she whispered, as they carefully hugged her. "I was so worried." "Mr. Harrison is letting us stay at his house, Mom," Lucas explained excitedly. "It's huge." Catherine's eyes found Blake, standing uncomfortably at the doorway. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "There's no need," Blake replied, stiffly. The doctor arrived with updates explaining Catherine's condition in simplified terms for the twins. "Your mom's kidneys weren't working properly. We're helping them filter her blood while they heal." "Will she get better?" Zach asked, clutching his mother's hand. "With continued treatment, yes," the doctor confirmed. "But it will take time." On the drive back, the twins were quiet, processing their mother's condition. "Why are you helping us?" Lucas finally asked, breaking the silence. Blake stared out the window, watching the city pass. Why indeed? He'd spent years building walls around himself, focusing solely on his empire. Why risk pain by letting these strangers in? Sometimes people just need help, he answered eventually, avoiding the deeper truth. That night, after the twins were asleep, Blake stood before the locked door, key in hand. Inside was everything he'd tried to forget. Photos, toys, memories preserved like insects in amber. His fingers tightened around the key, then released. Not tonight. Perhaps not ever. Behind him, the house felt different. No longer just an empty monument to his success, but temporarily alive with the presence of children again. The sensation was both comforting and terrifying. A week passed, settling into an unexpected rhythm. Each morning, Blake found himself waking earlier than usual, listening for the sounds of life in his formerly silent home. The twins' footsteps, their whispered conversations, even their occasional disagreements had become part of the mansion's new soundtrack. Blake's staff adapted with professional efficiency, though not without curiosity. Mrs. Winters stocked the kitchen with child-friendly foods, while the groundskeeper found himself answering endless questions about the gardens from two identical shadows that followed him around. "Mr. Harrison," Zach approached Blake as he worked in his home office. "Can we visit Mom today?" Blake checked his watch. "We'll go after lunch. How's the room working out for you both?" "It's awesome," Zach replied, his eyes brightening. "Lucas found a chess set in the closet. Do you play?" Blake's fingers stilled on his keyboard. "I used to. Could you teach us sometime?" The boy's hopeful expression made declining impossible. "Perhaps," Blake answered, returning to his work. Zach lingered a moment before retreating, leaving Blake alone with an unexpected surge of emotion. At the hospital, Catherine's improvement was evident. Color had returned to her cheeks, and she sat up, embracing her sons as they bounded into the room. "The doctors say I'm responding well to treatment," she told Blake as the twins explored the small hospital room. "I don't know how I'll ever repay—" "Don't," Blake interrupted. "Focus on recovery." Later, as the twins chatted animatedly with a nurse, Catherine studied Blake more carefully. "You don't have children of your own?" she asked quietly. Blake's posture stiffened. "No," he answered. Then, after a pause, "Not anymore." Catherine's eyes widened slightly at the implication, but before she could respond, Lucas called for her attention, breaking the moment. That evening, dinner at the mansion was interrupted by a crash from the living room. Blake and Mrs. Winters rushed in to find Zach standing horrified before the shattered remains of an antique vase. "I'm sorry," the boy stammered, eyes wide with fear. "I was just looking. I didn't mean to." Blake surveyed the damage. The vase, a rare piece he'd acquired at auction years ago, lay in irreparable pieces. "Are you hurt?" he asked calmly. Zach shook his head, clearly expecting punishment. "Good," Blake said. "Mrs. Winters, please clean this up." To Zach's astonishment, Blake simply turned and walked back toward the dining room. "Aren't you mad?" Zach asked, following cautiously. Blake paused. "It's just a thing," he said. "Things can be replaced." Later that night, unable to sleep, Blake wandered the darkened house. Passing the twins' room, he heard soft sobbing. He hesitated, then quietly opened the door. Lucas sat awake in bed, tears streaming down his face. Zach slept soundly in the adjacent bed. "What's wrong?" Blake asked. keeping his voice low. "I miss Mom," Lucas whispered. "What if she doesn't get better?" Blake sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "The doctors are very good. She's already improving." Lucas looked up, his tear-stained face vulnerable in the dim light. "Our dad died when we were 5. Mom said sometimes people just don't come back." The simple statement hit Blake with unexpected force. Without thinking, he reached out, awkwardly patting the boy's shoulder. "Your mother is coming back," he promised. "Try to sleep now." As he closed the door behind him, Blake felt something shift inside, a crack in the careful fortress he'd built around his heart, letting in both pain and something else he wasn't ready to name. 2 weeks into their stay, the mansion had transformed. Schoolbooks now littered the dining table as Blake had arranged for temporary homeschooling. Children's jackets hung beside expensive coats in the foyer. The pristine silence had given way to lively chatter and occasional laughter. Today brought news they'd all been waiting for. Catherine was being released for outpatient treatment. Blake's driver brought her directly from the hospital, the twins, bouncing impatiently by the front door until they spotted the car approaching. "Mom!" they shouted in unison, rushing down the steps as Catherine emerged, still thin but standing straight. Color returned to her face. Blake watched from the doorway as the family embraced, feeling strangely like an outsider witnessing something precious. Catherine looked up, catching his eye, and smiled with genuine warmth. Something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. "Welcome," he said simply as they approached. "This is overwhelming," Catherine admitted, taking in the mansion's grandeur. "We can't possibly impose—" "You're not imposing," Blake interrupted. "The doctor said you need rest and continued treatment. This is the most practical arrangement." Mrs. Winters appeared, offering to show Catherine to her room. The twins immediately volunteered as tour guides, eager to show their mother everything they'd discovered. That evening, for the first time, all 4 ate dinner together. The twins dominated the conversation, updating Catherine on their temporary life, the gardens they'd explored, the chess lessons Blake had reluctantly begun giving them, the planets Blake's telescope could see. "You've been teaching them chess?" Catherine asked Blake during a rare pause. Blake nodded, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. They asked. "He's really good, Mom," Lucas added. "He says we're learning fast because we have good spatial." He looked at Blake for help. "Spatial reasoning," Blake supplied. Catherine smiled. "They've always been quick learners." Her expression turned serious. "But we need to discuss what happens next. The doctor says I'll need ongoing treatment for months, and I need to find work that can accommodate." "One step at a time," Blake interrupted. "Your treatment schedule is arranged, everything else can wait." Later, after the twins were asleep, Blake found Catherine in the library, examining family photos displayed on a shelf. Carefully curated images of Blake's parents and business, achievements with conspicuous gaps. "Thank you," she said without turning. "Not just for the medical care, but for making my boys feel safe. They've had so little stability." Blake remained in the doorway. "They're remarkable children." They mentioned a locked room, Catherine said carefully. "They think it might be filled with treasure." Blake's posture stiffened. "Just storage," he lied. Catherine turned, studying him with gentle perception. "I understand privacy, Mr. Harrison. We all have parts of ourselves we keep locked away." The simple understanding in her voice nearly undid him. For years, colleagues and associates had tiptoed around his past, treating him like a ticking bomb. Catherine's straightforward acknowledgement was disarming. "Blake," he said suddenly. "Please call me Blake." She nodded. "Blake, then." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unasked questions. "I should rest," Catherine finally said. "Good night, Blake." After she left, Blake poured himself a drink, contemplating how quickly these strangers had infiltrated his carefully constructed solitude. The most disturbing realization wasn't that he minded their presence, but that he was beginning to dread their eventual departure. Out of habit, his hand reached into his pocket where he still carried the twins' toy car. He examined it under the lamp's glow, running his thumb over its worn edges. wondering how something so small could have triggered such significant disruption to his life. Blake sat alone in his office, quarterly reports forgotten on his desk. Outside, he could hear the twins laughing as they kicked a soccer ball across the lawn. The sound penetrated the thick windows, infiltrating the sanctuary he'd maintained for years. 3 weeks had passed since Catherine's release from the hospital. Her strength returned gradually, but her medical team insisted on continued rest between treatments. The temporary arrangement showed no signs of ending soon, a fact that left Blake increasingly conflicted. His phone buzzed with a message from his executive assistant. "Board meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Confirm attendance?" Blake stared at the screen. He'd been working remotely, making occasional appearances at the office when necessary. His absence had sparked rumors, which his team managed efficiently. Yet the truth, that he, Blake Harrison, ruthless business titan, was playing host to a struggling single mother and her twins, would be incomprehensible to his colleagues. "Confirmed," he typed, then set the phone aside. The office door opened, slowly, and Lucas peered in. "Mr. Blake, Mom said to tell you dinner's ready." Catherine had insisted on cooking whenever she felt strong enough. To earn her keep, she'd explained, despite Blake's protests. Her simple, home-cooked meals had become strangely meaningful, bringing them together around the dining table each evening. "I'll be right there," Blake replied. Lucas hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" Blake nodded, gesturing for the boy to enter. "Why do you always keep that toy car in your pocket? The one we sold you?" Blake's hand instinctively touched his jacket, pocket where the small car indeed rested. He hadn't realized the boy had noticed. "I'm not sure," he answered honestly. Lucas approached, stopping respectfully before the desk. "It was our dad's. He gave it to us before he died." Blake felt a stab of guilt. "I didn't know. You should have it back." Lucas shook his head. "We sold it fair. Mom says a deal is a deal." He studied Blake curiously. "Did you have kids? Is that why you have that locked room?" The directness of the question knocked the air from Blake's lungs. In the corporate world, no one dared mention his past. So bluntly, "I did," he admitted, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "A son." What happened to him? Blake should have shut down the conversation, changed the subject, maintained the walls he'd built. Instead, he heard himself answer, "There was an accident, a car accident. He and my wife were killed." Lucas absorbed this with solemn understanding beyond his years. "That's why you helped us, isn't it? Because we reminded you of him." Blake looked away, uncomfortable with the boy's perception. "Perhaps. Mom says people come into our lives for a reason," Lucas continued. "Maybe we came into yours to help you too." Before Blake could respond, Zach appeared at the door. "Come on. Mom made spaghetti." Lucas smiled and followed his brother. At the doorway, he turned back. "You should come too, Mr. Blake. It's better when we're all together." Dinner that night was animated, the twins recounting their soccer game while Catherine smiled at their enthusiasm. Blake observed quietly, struck by how the formal dining room, previously used only for rare business dinners, had transformed into a space of genuine warmth. "The boys tell me you have a board meeting tomorrow," Catherine said as the twins cleared the dishes, insisting on helping despite Mrs. Winter's presence. "Yes," Blake confirmed. "I should be back by evening." Catherine nodded. "We'll manage fine. It's good for you to return to normal life." But as Blake looked around the table, he realized with startling clarity that this improvised family dinner with people who had been strangers weeks ago felt more like normal life than anything he'd experienced in years. The realization terrified him. The board meeting dragged interminably. Blake found himself checking his watch repeatedly, his mind wandering to the mansion and its temporary residents. When his CFO asked about quarterly projections, Blake had to request the question be repeated, an unprecedented lapse in his legendary focus. "Everything all right, Blake?" his COO asked during a break, genuine concern in his voice. "Fine," Blake replied curtly. "Let's finish this." By the time he returned home, evening had fallen. The mansion was unusually quiet as he entered. Following the sound of hushed voices, he found Catherine in the twins' room, sitting beside Zach's bed. "What happened?" Blake asked, seeing the boy's flushed face. "Fever," Catherine explained, worry etched in her features. "It came on suddenly this afternoon." Zach managed a weak smile. "Hi, Mr. Blake." Lucas sat cross-legged on his own bed, watching his brother anxiously. "He threw up twice," he reported solemnly. Blake approached, noting Zach's glazed eyes and labored breathing. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and dialed his personal physician. "He'll be here in 20 minutes, Blake announced after a brief conversation. Catherine looked up, startled. "A house call? That's not necessary." "It is," Blake interrupted. "We don't know if this is related to your condition or something contagious. Better to be cautious." The doctor confirmed it was just a common virus, prescribing rest and fluids. Yet even after this reassurance, Blake found himself returning to check on Zach throughout the night, an inexplicable anxiety gripping him each time he walked away. During Selma's one such visit, he found Catherine asleep in the chair beside Zach's bed, her hand still resting on her son's forehead. In sleep, the strain of recent months showed plainly on her face. Blake quietly draped a blanket over her shoulders, then stood watching both mother and child, an unfamiliar ache spreading through his chest. The next morning, Zach's fever had broken. Blake canceled his meetings again, working from home while periodically checking on the boy's recovery. By afternoon, Zach was sitting up, sipping ginger ale while Lucas entertained him with exaggerated stories. "You didn't have to stay home," Catherine said, finding Blake in his study later. "We could have managed." Blake looked up from his laptop. "I wanted to be sure he was recovering." Catherine studied him with that perceptive gaze that always made him feel transparent. "You care about them." It wasn't a question. Blake closed his laptop, struggling with how to respond. "The boys have started calling you Mr. Blake instead of Mr. Harrison," she continued. "They've become attached to you. And that concerns you," Blake surmised. Catherine sighed, sitting in the chair opposite his desk. "We can't stay here forever, Blake. Eventually I'll be well enough to work again, to provide for my sons properly. And then—" She left the sentence unfinished, but its conclusion hung heavily in the air. Then they would leave. Return to their own life. This temporary intersection would end. "My treatments are working better than expected," Catherine continued, softly. "The doctor says I might be ready for reduced sessions within a month. I've started looking at apartments we can afford." Blake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "There's no rush," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "There is," Catherine countered gently. "The longer we stay, the harder it will be for all of us when we leave." Blake had no response. In business, he never hesitated, never showed uncertainty. But this wasn't business. This was something he'd deliberately avoided for years. Emotional entanglement, the risk of caring too deeply. "You've given us so much already," Catherine said, rising to leave. "We can't take advantage of your generosity forever." As she reached the door, Blake finally spoke. "And if I asked you to stay?" The question surprised them both. Catherine turned, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. "Why would you?" she asked softly. Blake had no answer, at least, none he was ready to voice aloud. That night, Blake stood before the locked door, key trembling slightly in his hand. For 5 years, he'd preserved this room exactly as it had been the day of the accident. Thomas's room, frozen in time, like a memorial. His conversation with Catherine echoed in his mind. "And if I asked you to stay?" The words had escaped before he could stop them, revealing more than he'd intended. With a deep breath, Blake inserted the key. The lock turned with a soft click that seemed to reverberate through the silent hallway. He pushed the door open slowly, dust particles dancing in the beam of light from the corridor. Everything remained as he'd left it. The blue walls covered with solar system decals, the bookshelf filled with adventure stories, The bed with its rumpled spaceship comforter that Mrs. Winters had been instructed never to touch. On the bedside table, a framed photo of Thomas with Blake and his wife, Sarah, all smiling on a beach vacation, their last together. Blake stepped inside, overwhelmed by memories. He picked up a toy car from the collection displayed on a shelf, identical to the one the twins had sold him. Thomas had loved cars too. Mr. Blake? He turned sharply. Lucas stood in the doorway, eyes wide with curiosity and uncertainty. "You shouldn't be here," Blake said, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry," Lucas whispered. "I heard the door open." His gaze traveled around the room, understanding dawning on his young face. "This was your son's room." Blake nodded, unable to speak. "What was his name?" "Thomas." "Was he our age?" "He would be now. He was 5 when—" Blake couldn't finish. Lucas entered cautiously, approaching the photo on the nightstand. "You all look happy." "We were." Lucas studied the picture, then looked up at Blake. "My mom says Dad watches over us from heaven. Maybe Thomas watches over you too." The simple statement, delivered with a child's certainty, cracked something inside. Blake. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, emotions he'd suppressed for years finally breaking through. "I miss him," Blake admitted, the words barely audible. "Every day." "We miss our dad too," Lucas said, sitting beside him. "Mom says it's okay to be sad sometimes, but we shouldn't forget to be happy too." From the doorway came a small gasp. Zach stood there, still pale from his illness but eyes wide at the forbidden room. Behind him, Catherine appeared, her expression softening as she took in the scene. "Boys, come away," she said gently. "This is private." "It's all right," Blake found himself saying. "They can come in." Zach approached cautiously, examining the room with quiet reverence. "Cool space lamp," he observed, pointing to a rocket-shaped nightlight. "Thomas was afraid of the dark," Blake explained, surprising himself with how easily the words came now. "We bought this on his 5th birthday." Catherine remained in the doorway, watching as Blake began showing the twins Thomas's favorite, books and toys. Each object came with a story, memories Blake had locked away now flowing freely. The pain was still there, but somehow sharing it made it bearable. Later, after the twins had gone to bed, Catherine found Blake still in Thomas's room, sitting quietly. "I'm sorry they intruded," she said. "They're naturally curious." "Don't be," Blake replied. "It was time to open this door." Catherine leaned against the doorframe. "It's a beautiful room. He must have been a wonderful little boy." "He was." Blake looked up at her. "The accident was my fault. I was driving. A truck ran a red light. I survived. They didn't." Catherine crossed the room and sat beside him. "That's why you've isolated yourself all these years. You're punishing yourself." The simple truth of her assessment left him speechless. "Survivor's guilt is a terrible burden," she continued softly. "But living half a life doesn't honor their memory." Blake looked into her compassionate eyes and felt, for the first time in years, like someone truly saw him. Not the successful CEO, but the broken man beneath the perfect facade. "I don't know how to stop," he confessed. Catherine placed her hand over his. "Maybe you've already started." Spring arrived, bringing transformation to both the estate grounds and its inhabitants. The gardens Blake had maintained, but rarely enjoyed, now became a sanctuary where the twins explored daily. Catherine's health improved steadily, her face regaining its natural glow, her strength returning with each passing week. Most remarkably transformed, however, was Blake himself. The change happened gradually, so subtly that an outsider might not notice. But Catherine observed how his rigid posture softened when the boys entered a room, how genuine smiles occasionally replaced his customary stern expression. One sunny Saturday, Blake surprised everyone by canceling his usual weekend work session and suggesting they all visit the city's Natural History Museum. "Really?" Zach exclaimed, nearly dropping his cereal spoon. "The dinosaur exhibit just opened," Blake said casually. as if family outings were commonplace for him. Unless you'd prefer something else. Dinosaurs are perfect, Lucas confirmed enthusiastically. Catherine watched this exchange with quiet amazement. Are you sure, Blake? You usually work Saturdays. Work can wait, he replied, their eyes meeting briefly in shared understanding of how significant this statement was for a man who had built his life around his company. The museum trip marked a turning point. For the first time, they ventured out together beyond medical appointments, a visible unit that drew curious glances from museum staff who recognized the famous CEO, accompanied by a woman and identical boys. Blake, normally hyper-aware of public perception, seemed indifferent to the attention. Look, Mr. Blake, Zach called, pointing excitedly at a massive T-Rex skeleton. This one's even bigger than the model in your library. Blake found himself caught up in their enthusiasm, answering endless questions about prehistoric creatures with information gleaned from books he'd read to Thomas years ago. When Lucas took his hand to drag him toward the next exhibit, Blake didn't pull away, an instinctive acceptance of physical connection that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Watching from a bench while the three examined a fossil display, Catherine felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Blake had changed from intimidating benefactor to something else entirely, a man who genuinely cared for her sons, who had opened himself to connection despite his painful past. The most troubling realization wasn't that she was grateful, but that she was growing attached in ways that went beyond gratitude. Ice cream? Blake suggested as they exited the museum, noticing a vendor across the street. The twins didn't need to be asked twice. As they raced ahead, Catherine and Blake followed at a slower pace. Thank you for today, she said. I haven't seen them this excited in a long time. I enjoyed it too, Blake admitted. More than I expected. You're good with them, Catherine observed. Patient. Not many men would be. Blake watched the twins comparing ice cream flavors at the counter. They make it easy. They're remarkable children. You've given them something invaluable, Catherine said softly. Stability, security, a male presence they can trust. Blake turned to her, his expression serious. Catherine, about what you said last week. Looking for an apartment. Blake, she interrupted gently. We can't stay in your world forever. You've already done more than anyone could expect. What if I want you to stay? The words hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to fully address. Before Catherine could respond, the twins returned, proudly displaying elaborate ice cream concoctions. Mr. Blake, can we go to the park next weekend? Lucas asked eagerly. Perhaps, Blake replied, glancing at Catherine. We'll see. That evening, as the twins recounted their museum adventures to Mrs. Winters, Blake found Catherine in Thomas's room. She stood by the bookshelf, examining a model airplane hanging from the ceiling. I used to imagine leaving was the right thing, she said without turning. For you, for us. A clean break before everyone gets too attached. She finally faced him. But I'm beginning to think that might no longer be possible. Blake stepped into the room, the space no longer filled with just pain and memory, but something new. Possibility. Then don't leave, he said simply. Morning. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Catherine prepared breakfast, moving with an ease that reflected her improving health. The aroma of coffee and pancakes filled the air, creating a sense of domestic tranquility that had once been unimaginable in Blake's austere home. Need help? Blake asked, entering the kitchen in casual weekend attire rather than his usual business suit. Catherine smiled. You can set the table. The boys should be down any minute. They worked together in comfortable silence, the routine now familiar after 2 months of cohabitation. When Blake's hand accidentally brushed against hers while reaching for plates, neither pulled away immediately, a subtle acknowledgement of the growing connection between them. Dr. Levine says I can reduce my treatments to once weekly, Catherine mentioned, flipping a pancake. My kidney function has stabilized beyond their expectations. Blake paused, That's wonderful news. It is, she agreed, though her tone carried a hint of uncertainty. It also means I need to think seriously about work. I can't be financially dependent forever. Before Blake could respond, thundering footsteps announced the twins' arrival. They burst into the kitchen already dressed for their Saturday baseball practice, another new addition to the household routine. "Mom! Mr. Blake!" Zach exclaimed. "Coach said I might pitch today." "And I'm playing first base," Lucas added proudly. Breakfast. Conversation centered on baseball strategy and team standings. The earlier tension momentarily set aside. Blake, who had never attended a sporting event that wasn't a corporate sponsorship opportunity, found himself genuinely invested in the twins' athletic progress. At the local field, Blake and Catherine sat together on aluminum bleachers, watching the boys warm up with their teammates. Several parents nodded respectfully toward Blake, though none approached. His reputation for privacy preceded him. "They've grown," Catherine observed. "Their clothes from February barely fit now." "Children do that," Blake replied with a small smile. "Grow when you least expect it." Catherine turned to study his profile. "Not just physically, they're happier, more confident. That's because of you, Blake." He shook his head. "They're resilient, and they have you. But now they have you too," she said softly. "They talk about you constantly." Mr. Blake showed us how to use the telescope. Mr. Blake explained how airplanes fly. Mr. Blake promised to teach us chess openings. Blake watched as Zach took position on the pitcher's mound, his small face concentrated with determination. "I never expected this," Blake admitted. "Any of it." "Neither did I," Catherine replied. "When you appeared at our door that day, I thought you were just a wealthy man assuaging his conscience with charity. And now? Now I know better." Their eyes met, communicating more than words could express. The moment was interrupted by cheers as Zach struck out his first batter. Blake found himself on his feet, applauding more enthusiastically than he had for any business achievement. Later that evening, after the twins had gone to bed, Blake and Catherine sat on the terrace, the spring air mild and fragrant with blooming flowers. Between them rested the real estate listings Catherine had been discreetly researching. "These are all too far from your treatments," Blake observed, examining the circled apartments. "They're what I can afford," Catherine replied pragmatically. "I've applied for administrative positions that would accommodate my medical schedule." Blake set the papers aside. "There's another option." "Blake, hear me out," he interrupted, gently. "This house has 7 bedrooms. The boys are thriving in their school. Your medical team is nearby." He paused, gathering courage. "Stay. Not as temporary guests, but permanently." Catherine looked away, her profile gilded by moonlight. "People would talk. They'd say I manipulated you, that the boys and I are taking advantage." "Let them talk," Blake said with sudden fierceness. "I've spent 5 years making decisions based on what others might think, on maintaining perfect control. I'm tired of it." "What exactly are you proposing?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake reached across the table, taking her hand. "I'm proposing we stop pretending this is temporary, that we acknowledge whatever this is between us deserves a chance." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm not asking for immediate answers. Just don't leave yet." Catherine's eyes glistened in the dim light. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of you, but of hoping again, of letting the boys hope." "I'm afraid too," Blake confessed. "But for the first time in years, I'm more afraid of losing something than of having it." As the night deepened around them, neither moved to break the connection of their intertwined hands, a silent agreement to face their fears together. Summer arrived in full splendor, transforming the estate's formal gardens into a playground, where the twins spent endless hours exploring, building forts, and occasionally helping the amused groundskeeper with simple tasks. The mansion itself had undergone a more subtle transformation. Children's artwork now adorned the refrigerator, colorful sneakers cluttered the entryway, and laughter echoed through previously silent corridors. 3 months had passed since Blake's proposition on the terrace. Catherine had neither accepted nor rejected his offer of permanence, but they had fallen into a comfortable rhythm that felt increasingly like family life. "Mom, Mr. Blake, look what we found," Lucas called one Saturday morning, bursting into the breakfast room where Blake and Catherine were quietly enjoying coffee. Both boys appeared muddy and triumphant, holding a small turtle between them. "He was by the pond," Zach explained excitedly. "Can we keep him, please?" Blake glanced at Catherine, who raised an eyebrow in silent communication. Their newfound ability to converse without words, one of many developments in their evolving relationship. "A turtle requires proper care," Blake replied thoughtfully. "Perhaps we should research what he needs first." "We could build him a habitat," Lucas suggested. "Mr. Blake, you said you had building supplies in the garage, right?" "I did," Blake confirmed, surprising himself with how naturally he now included the boys in his plans and possessions. Catherine watched this exchange with a gentle smile. "Wash up first, then we can look up turtle care online." The boys dashed off, leaving muddy footprints that would have once horrified Blake but now barely registered. "You realize this means we'll be constructing a turtle paradise this afternoon," Catherine said with amusement. "I've negotiated billion-dollar contracts," Blake replied dryly. "I suspect I can handle turtle architecture." Their laughter mingled easily, a sound that had become increasingly common. The day unfolded in domestic harmony, researching turtle habitats online, gathering supplies, and working together in the garden to create a suitable home for the reptilian visitor. Blake, who once delegated every task to staff, found himself kneeling in dirt, patiently explaining to the twins how to create proper drainage for their habitat. Mrs. Winters, bringing lemonade to the garden, paused to observe her employer, the formidable CEO now sporting dirt-smudged khakis and a relaxed smile as he worked alongside the boys. The housekeeper exchanged a knowing glance with Catherine, both women silently acknowledging the transformation. That evening, after tucking the twins into bed, another ritual Blake had gradually joined. He and Catherine settled in the library, with glasses of wine. "The turtle habitat is quite impressive," Catherine commented, curling comfortably into a corner of the sofa. "You've missed your calling as an environmental engineer." Blake smiled, his posture more relaxed than she'd ever seen in their early days. "The board would be shocked to see me covered in mud and pond water." "Your company has been patient with your reduced schedule," Catherine observed. "The benefits of being the founder," Blake replied, "though my executive team has handled things admirably in my partial absence." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock and the distant sounds of the house settling. "I received a job offer today," Catherine said finally. "Administrative director at a nonprofit. The salary is modest but adequate, and they're willing to accommodate my treatment schedule." Blake set down his wine glass carefully. "Congratulations," he said, his tone measured. "When would you start?" "I haven't accepted yet," Catherine replied, watching his expression. "It would mean decisions about other matters." The unspoken question hung between them. Would accepting the job mean leaving the estate, ending this careful dance they'd been performing? "Blake," Catherine continued softly, "we've lived in this beautiful limbo for months now. The boys consider this home. They consider you." She hesitated. "Family?" Blake supplied, his voice carrying a hint of vulnerability rarely revealed. Catherine nodded. "They've grown to love you. And I—" She stopped, suddenly uncertain. Blake moved closer on the sofa, taking her hand. "And you?" Catherine met his gaze directly. "I've grown to love the man behind the fortress, the man who builds turtle habitats and cheers at Little League games, the man who opened locked doors." Blake's thumb traced circles on her palm. "I never expected to feel this way again," he admitted. "After losing Sarah and Thomas, I convinced myself it was safer to feel nothing. And now?" Catherine prompted gently. "Now I find myself terrified by how much I have to lose," Blake confessed. how essential you and the boys have become to my life. Catherine leaned forward until their foreheads touched. Then ask us to stay, she whispered. Not as guests or charity cases. Ask us properly. Blake sat in his office the following morning, staring at the small velvet box on his desk. The antique ring inside, his grandmother's, had been in a safe deposit box for years. He'd retrieved it yesterday after his conversation with Catherine, his mind racing with possibilities. Ask us properly, she had said. The words echoed in his mind, both thrilling and terrifying. Blake Harrison, who made multi-million-dollar decisions daily without hesitation, found himself paralyzed by uncertainty. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Blake. Lucas peered around the door. Mom said to tell you lunch is ready. I'll be right there, Blake replied, quickly slipping the ring box into his desk drawer. Lucas lingered. Are you okay? You look worried. Blake managed a smile. Just thinking about some important decisions. About us staying? Lucas asked with startling directness. Zach and I want to stay. Forever. Blake's breath caught. You do? Lucas nodded solemnly. Mom's happier here, and you're happier with us, we can tell. You're very perceptive, Blake observed. The boy shrugged. Twins notice things. He hesitated, then added, Mom loves you, you know. She smiles different when you're around. Before Blake could respond, Lucas disappeared down the hallway, leaving him stunned by the simple wisdom of a 10-year-old. At lunch, Blake found himself studying Catherine across the table as she laughed at something Zach said. She caught his gaze and smiled, that special smile Lucas had mentioned, sending warmth spreading through his chest. I thought we might visit the lake this afternoon, Blake suggested as they finished eating. The weather's perfect for it. The twins cheered their approval. Blake's estate included a small private lake, complete with a boathouse and dock, which had become a favorite spot during the summer heat. Hours later, as the sun began its descent, Catherine and Blake sat on the dock watching the twins splash in the shallows. A comfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the boys' laughter and the occasional call of birds. I spoke with the nonprofit director this morning, Catherine said finally. I asked for a few more days to consider their offer. Blake nodded, his fingers unconsciously touching the ring box in his pocket. What's holding you back? Catherine turned to face him fully. You know exactly what's holding me back, Blake. The same thing that's had you distracted all day. Her expression softened. Whatever you're wrestling with, just say it. Blake took a deep breath. When I bought that toy car from the boys, I never imagined where it would lead. I was empty, functioning but not living. He gazed out at the twins. Then suddenly my house was full of noise and chaos and life again. It wasn't just charity, was it? Catherine asked quietly. Even at the beginning. Blake shook his head. I told myself it was, that I was just helping because I could. But from that first day, seeing those twin boys trying so desperately to save their mother, he met her eyes. They reminded me of Thomas, but they also reminded me of what it meant to care deeply about something beyond myself. Catherine reached for his hand. And now? Now I can't imagine this house without you in it, without the boys, running through the halls without your laugh in the kitchen, without. He squeezed her hand. Without the family we've somehow become. The twins' splashing grew more distant as they chased each other along the shoreline, giving the adults a moment of privacy. I used to think I didn't deserve happiness, Blake continued. That surviving when Sarah and Thomas didn't was some cosmic punishment. And now? Catherine prompted again. Now I think maybe they would want this for me. For us. Blake reached into his pocket and withdrew the ring box. I've been carrying this around all day, trying to find the perfect moment, the perfect words. Catherine's eyes widened as he opened the box, revealing a vintage emerald surrounded by diamonds. I'm not offering security or stability or financial support, Blake said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I'm offering partnership. family. A life together that honors both our pasts, but isn't defined by them. He took her hand. Catherine Wilson, will you and your remarkable sons make this house a home permanently? Will you marry me? Catherine's eyes filled with tears. For a moment that stretched eternally, she simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, we'll stay. Yes, I'll marry you. Blake slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, then pulled her close. Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with the promise of shared futures and healing hearts. They broke apart at the sound of approaching footsteps. The twins ran toward them, dripping wet and curious. What's happening? Zach asked, noticing his mother's tears and Blake's uncharacteristically emotional expression. Catherine extended her hand, showing them the ring. Mr. Blake has asked us to stay, permanently, as a family. The boys stared at the ring, then at the adults, processing this information. Does that mean you're getting married? Lucas asked cautiously. Blake nodded. If that's all right with you? Both. The twins exchanged one of their silent communications, then broke into identical grins. Does this mean we can call you Dad? Zach asked boldly. The question hit Blake with unexpected force. He had been prepared for hesitation, for a gradual transition. Instead, these remarkable boys offered immediate acceptance, a gift he never thought he'd receive again. I would be honored, Blake said, his voice rough with emotion. But only when you're ready. The twins launched themselves forward, wrapping their arms around both adults in an enthusiastic group hug that nearly toppled everyone into the lake. Laughter and tears mingled as the newly defined family held each other close, the setting sun casting them in golden light. Later that night, as the twins slept and Catherine admired her ring in the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window, Blake found himself thinking of Thomas. For the first time, the memory brought bittersweet joy rather than crushing pain, the sense that his son would approve of the family his father had found. In his pocket, Blake still carried the twins' toy car, now a talisman of unexpected beginnings, rather than painful endings. Blake Harrison, once known only for his business acumen and reclusive nature, now found himself the subject of different kinds of whispers as he, Catherine, and the twins entered the charity gala. 6 months had passed since his proposal by the lake. The announcement of their engagement had created ripples throughout Boston's elite circles. Blake, called Richard Thornton, chairman of Blake's board. We were beginning to think you'd become entirely domestic these days. Blake guided Catherine forward, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Richard, I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Catherine Wilson. Catherine, elegant in a midnight blue gown that complemented the emerald on her finger, extended, her hand with quiet confidence. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Thornton. Blake speaks highly of your business partnership. Richard's expression betrayed momentary surprise before he recovered his polished charm. The pleasure is mine. Blake has been different these past months, happier. Now I understand why. As they moved through the crowded ballroom, Blake introduced Catherine to colleagues and business associates. Some responded with genuine warmth, others with barely concealed curiosity about the woman who had captured the heart of Boston's most eligible widower. They're wondering what my angle is, Catherine murmured as they stepped onto the dance floor. The single mother who somehow ensnared the billionaire. Blake drew her closer, moving smoothly to the orchestra's waltz. Let them wonder. We know. The truth, Catherine smiled up at him. Which is? That I'm the fortunate one, Blake replied, his voice low and sincere. That somehow I was given a second chance at happiness I never thought I deserved. Later that evening, as they drove home, Catherine rested her head against Blake's shoulder. The boys will want a full report. Zach was convinced you'd be eating from golden plates. Blake chuckled. Wait until they hear about the chocolate fountain. They found Mrs. Winters in the living room reading to the twins who had stubbornly refused to sleep until their mother and Blake returned. Mom, Dad, Zach exclaimed, the term Dad now comfortably established in their daily lexicon. How was the fancy party? Blake still felt a surge of emotion each time the boys called him Dad, a title he thought he'd never hear again. Less exciting than you'd imagine, he replied, loosening his tie. Mostly grown-ups talking about boring things. Did you dance? Lucas asked, scrambling to make room on the sofa for them. Catherine kicked off her heels with a sigh of relief. We did. Your future dad is surprisingly good at it. The twins looked impressed. Can you teach us? Lucas asked. For when we go to fancy parties too? Of course, Blake promised, settling beside them, though those might be a few years away yet. Mrs. Winters excused herself, smiling at the family tableau, so different from the solitary evenings that had once defined this household. I got an A on my science project, Zach announced proudly. Mrs. Peterson said my ecosystem model was exceptional, and I got picked for the school play, Lucas added, not to be outdone. Catherine and Blake exchanged glances of parental pride. These ordinary achievements, homework, school activities, small triumphs, and occasional failures, had become the precious fabric of their shared life. Later, after the twins had finally been persuaded to bed, Blake and Catherine stood in the doorway of Thomas's room, now a memorial space where photographs of both their past and present families shared space. Blake had suggested converting it to a proper bedroom for one of the twins, but Catherine had insisted otherwise. He's part of our family story too, she'd said. We don't erase the past. We build on it. Now, as wedding plans progressed and their lives intertwined more completely, Blake realized how right she had been. The room had transformed from a shrine to grief into a bridge between past and future, much like Blake himself. 3 weeks until the wedding, Catherine said softly, leaning against him. Having second thoughts? Blake pulled her close. Only about letting the twins be in charge of the rings. I'm envisioning a dramatic chase scene mid-ceremony, Catherine laughed. They promised to be on their best behavior, and Mrs. Winters threatened to withhold dessert for a month if they misbehave. Powerful incentive, Blake agreed, turning off the light as they left the room. Though I wouldn't care if the entire ceremony descended into chaos. As long as at the end of it you're my wife and we're officially a family. Catherine kissed him softly. We already are, Blake. The wedding just makes it official. The garden radiated with springtime glory. Roses climbed trellises, cherry blossoms carpeted pathways, and sunlight dappled the assembled guests. 1 year to the day since Blake's proposal, family and close friends gathered to witness not a wedding, but a renewal of vows. Catherine, radiant in ivory lace, stood opposite Blake beneath an arch of flowers. Between them stood Zach and Lucas, handsome in matching suits, eyes bright with joy as they held the velvet cushions bearing rings. 1 year ago, the officiant began, these 4 souls officially became a family. Today they celebrate that journey and renew their promises. Blake gazed at Catherine, still amazed by the miracle of her presence in his life. When I met 2 determined boys selling a toy car, I never imagined they would lead me back to life, he said, voice steady with certainty. You and the boys, healed wounds I thought permanent. You turned my house back into a home. Catherine squeezed his hands. You saved us in every way a family can be saved. But more importantly, you loved us not out of obligation but with your whole heart. The twins presented the rings with perfect solemnity. As Blake slipped the band onto Catherine's finger, he noted the engraving inside. Second chances. Life had come full circle. What began with a small red toy car had transformed into something beautiful and enduring, proof that even the most wounded hearts could find healing through love's unexpected pathways.